Hello, thanks for joining us today on another edition of Real Money Stories. And this week, I'm talking to Davinia Tomlinson. Hello, Davinia.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Hi. Now, you're known as something else on Instagram, aren't you? You've got an alter ego. Do you want to tell everyone who that is and what that is?
Yes, so I'm Davinia in my daily life, but I'm Rainchq on Instagram.
Yes, and you are a bit of a... you're quite prolific on there, aren't you? I mean, I don't know how you managed to fit everything else in your life. My daughter manages my social channels, and she said to me, she brought you to my attention, said, this lady is very prolific and I like her style. So, so you must be doing something right. So before we move on, though, what do you do that full time, or do you do something else in your sort of day job, as it were, or how do you balance your daily activities?
So Rainchq, so obviously we have our social media presence, but actually the real activity of Rainchq exists offline. So it's a business that I set up 2 years ago, and it's designed to help women take control of their financial futures. So we run a membership platform offering financial education and access to qualified and regulated financial advice.
Good. So does that mean you're a financial advisor, or you've got links to regulated financial advisors?
We have links to them. So my background is in the investment management industry. And so, really the idea for Rainchq was spawned from my experience over the course of my career, and recognizing that women just weren't having deep enough conversations about their money and were generally being excluded by the industry. So Rainchq is my response to that.
Well, as a father of two daughters, 21 and 16, I'm very alive to that issue. And I always say to them, a man is not a plan. So you're preaching to the converted. And we'll get to what, we'll come back to that in a minute. But I'm really interested to know really the journey that got you inspired to start up Rainchq and the perceived gap that you felt, or the rather deficiency that women had around finances. So take us back to, where did you grow up? What was it like growing up where, in terms of finances and lifestyle?
Yeah. So I come from a Caribbean background, but I was born and raised in Birmingham, in a very traditional kind of nuclear, but ultimately extended family. So very used to, having lots of people around all the time. And money was something, I have to say, that wasn't necessarily talked about really in the family. I think my relationship with money really grew from observing my grandmother in particular. So when I think about, my parents and how they interacted with money, it wasn't really talked about. I know, for certain that my mom was the woman that held the purse strings in the house. And, my dad would go out to work, and my mom, was also working as well. But my dad would effectively hand the money over to my mom, and she would manage all of the household bills. That was how it worked in my household. But outside of that, I never really saw any conversations about money outside the odd bit of friction or tension when reserves were running low. But I think in terms of, cultivating a healthy relationship with money, which is, I think saw me through to where I am today, it was through, observing my grandmother, who, Windrush generation lady, moved to the UK from the Caribbean in the 60s, and essentially was able to build financial resilience and financial stability through working in quite manual level roles. But she was the first person that I knew in my life to have a financial advisor. She was very good with money management. She was very wary of debt. And I think, some of the principles I think good financial resilience were planted in my mind quite early on as a result of my relationship with her.
I'm always fascinated to speak to second, third generation immigrants to the country, because they have a very different perspective. Because if you think about it, your grandmother must be, I don't know if she's still with us, but what an incredible individual to come all that way to a foreign country with very little.
Yeah.
And she just had to get on, start at the bottom and work her way up, right? So what did you learn from her? What were the principles that your grandmother, you mentioned about she was aversion to debt. So you're already yes. on my side here, right? So we're the anti-debt family, the Butlers. So tell me what you learned from her in those early years that really formulated your relationship with money.
I think there is something about being resourceful. And, of course, exactly as you've described, immigrants to the country, you wouldn't really have had access to, you certainly couldn't have gone into a bank and got a loan very easily. They were in communal living spaces, and they had to support one another. And I think there's something about that principle, that idea of supporting one another financially, which has really stayed with me. And, when I think about Rainchq and the community that I'm building very slowly, that's one of the principles that I think really makes a difference to how people can uplift one another when it comes to their, whether it's their financial well-being or all other aspects of wellness, really. So there's certainly something about that. Partner hand, which I'm not sure whether it's something that you're familiar with, but again, this is a tradition that, is from the Caribbean. I know that there are other countries that have similar things. In West Africa, they have susu, but essentially it's this idea where everybody will contribute some money into a pot, and then it's almost rotated around. So when it's your turn to scoop up the collective amount of money that everybody has contributed towards, you can then use that to build some financial stability and foundations for yourself. And I know for lots of people of that generation, it would have been the basis upon which they were able to buy homes. Lots of those generations have quite big families. So my grandparents had 5 children. One set of grandparents had 5 children. Another set had 6 children. So when you're having to feed, clothe and house, these quite significant families, you really need that support, and anything that you can do to bolster your financial resilience is really key. But yeah, coming back to the point about resourcefulness, really thinking about budgeting, there's a whole industry that's kind of come out of this budgeting movement, particularly for women. There are lots of influencers online talking about different frameworks that you can use. But ultimately, when you're thinking about budgeting, all you're trying to do is make sure that you can eke out as much as you possibly can from whatever amount of money you have, rather than feeling like it's a stick to beat yourself with. And that was something that, again...
Yeah, so I was just going to say, but I'm interested in putting all that aside, the messages you got from your grandmother, because this seems really important, because many people in your community or might be thinking about kind of empowering themselves with their money, who they haven't got those role models, and I certainly didn't. I mean, my mum and dad showed you every way not to run the finances. Okay, so I suppose in a way that was good. But did you see? Tell me, did you see your grandmother? Did she show you budgeting, or did you see her budgeting? Was it jars above the fireplace and rent, food, and how did she budget? How did you learn that intentionality?
I think, quite similar to what you said about, what you tell your daughters about a man is not a plan. My gran always used to say, and I love that. And I've got 2 daughters as well, so I'm going to tell them that as well. My gran always used to say to us, make sure you save your money. So from a very early age, I remember my very first saving account was set up with her. I remember going to the high street in Kings Heath in the days when we had Abbey National, and going and setting up, and you had the little book, and they write down, and she would show me over, all of her various saving books over the years, and say, this is what happens. This is how many books, I've now accumulated over the course of my life. And now this is your very first book, and it's important. So anytime you get pocket money, when you start your first job, make sure, as well as spending, you're saving. And I think that was something that's really stood me in good stead, because it's always, I think when I moved out, left home, moved to London to start my graduate job, I remember thinking, oh, wow, like I'm earning more money than I've ever had before in my life. And I still remembered my grandmother saying, okay, now you're living in the big city, but still remember to save. So I think that, that's one of the best and most basic life lessons that anyone could learn, really.
So the old thing of spend on consumption less than you make. That's such a simple one. Yeah. I know it's simple.
Cut your cloth according to your size. Cut your cloth according to your size, is what she would say.
Dickens wrote all those years ago about Mr. Micawber. If you're spending more than you've got coming in, it's misery. But if you spend a bit less than you've got coming in, happiness. So, okay. So your grandmother clearly was a very, very important figure in your life. But your mum and dad, were they, what sort of, did you grow up in a modest sort of family? Was it sort of borderline poverty, or looking back, where was it relative to other people, and also relative to how you would see life now?
Yeah, that's a good question. At the time, looking through the lens of a small child, I remember thinking that we had a life of abundance, because I had everything that I wanted. I had, when Game Boy, when Nintendo was a thing in the UK in the 90s, anything that was trending, my parents made sure that I had it. And I don't remember necessarily being the kind of child that demanded those sorts of things, because I was quite a nerd, really. I was quite a bookworm. So if you gave me a book, I was always more than satisfied. But my parents always made sure I had those latest things. And actually, when I reflect back, it's probably because they grew up in those massive households, as I said, with lots of siblings, and probably didn't have those things. So it was really important for them. You see that quite commonly with people when they become parents. If you've grown up in a life of privation and you have children, you want to make sure that they've got all of these things. But But actually looking back, my parents really weren't earning very much at all. They would have been earning probably somewhere in the region of what would have then been national average earnings, but probably below, the median point of earnings. So they weren't earning a lot of money. My mom was, she worked in a school as a, classroom assistant. My dad was an electrician. I remember when I went to university and, you're means tested for access to, grants or whatever. And it was only at that juncture, it was really funny to me, it was at that juncture that I realized, what my parents were earning. And it meant that I was eligible for financial support, because I was the first cohort to have student loans and that kind of thing. And so, or have to pay school fees. And I remember thinking, wow, I've grown up thinking, I've got everything that I want. We don't worry about keeping a roof over our head or buying groceries or anything like that. But actually, I wonder whether the reality was quite different for my parents, and that, lots of the arguments that I would overhear would have been as a result of real friction and tension financially because of the level of earnings.
So you were gradually, as you were becoming a young adult, starting to get the veil of secrecy, not that it was secrecy, but the veil of transparency was being lifted, as it were, on you realizing that they perhaps weren't really earning huge amounts. You were doing well and you were comfortable, but essentially
absolutely
they were big rollers, as it were. So, okay, so what did you learn about the role of work then, and its role in your relationship with money as you were sort of going to university and understanding what your mum and dad weren't high rollers, as it were, but were working hard?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think, the one thing that's becoming apparent even in the course of this conversation is that when I contrast the relationship or the observations that I have based on my relationship with my grandmother, who I'm supremely close to even to today, I would spend every weekend with her, versus, what I observed in my parents' relationship with money. My parents were very comfortable with debt. And by that, I mean, they weren't heavily indebted. We didn't have loan shocks at the door, but I mean, there was in the 80s, for example, in the 80s and 90s, there was a real, it was catalogs. If you wanted to buy anything, clothes and shoes and things like that, lots of women had catalogs. And I know that my mom was somebody that had a catalogue. We would order things from there. And knowing what catalogues are, I mean, as a child, I was like, oh, I'll just go through and pick whatever I want from this catalogue. Yeah. But now I'm like, oh, actually, we were still having to pay that over the course of weeks or months in order to pay down those debts. And that's something my grandmother just simply would not have done.
And just for those people who don't know about catalogues, and I'm not, you're very young looking, Davinia, but catalogues were where you would have a big book, of 500 pages of all goods and clothes and furniture and everything. And it would say £4.60 a week. Okay. So what it does is it does three things. It gives you lots of temptation. It breaks down the seeming cost to an insignificant weekly amount, which is a classic marketing trick. Okay. And thirdly, it gets you to realize that it's affordable, that it's really, really simple, that it's easy. And then a person would come around every week and collect the cash. Now that's been supplanted by other types of credit agreements, but essentially it's how working class people became indebted, and they were paying something like 30% interest without even knowing it. And that's very similar to the rent to own type of thing, when you have a washing machine when you're renting it and eventually you might own it. So, okay, so moving on to uni, how did you come through uni unscathed, or did you rack up loads of debts and go partying and God knows what, or did you stick yourself down the library and keep it simple?
I was very much in the latter category, I have to say. Looking back, I wish that I was like a real hellraiser, but I was for my parents, honestly, I was just the dullest student. There was no partying. I would go to the occasional party, sure, but there wasn't at all. I was the person that would get my papers in advance. There was no cramming at the last minute. I'm just not that person.
Yeah.
So yeah.
You came out intact. And how did you find the transition of mum and dad sort of dealing with all the paying bills? So suddenly you're in digs, or you're perhaps second year student, which is the big baptism of fire, having to buy food and balance your budget. I mean, did you find that easy, and what tips would you share with people?
I did find that quite easy, but again, I think, going back to the point about my grandmother and resourcefulness, and I think it's endemic in Caribbean culture. You learn to buy things in bulk. It's the big family things. You buy rice in sacks, you buy pasta in sacks. You can make a meal out of, with your rice, you'll have lots of tins of tomatoes and some fresh vegetables, and you can put something together and it's fine. Yeah. I love that you love that, because it's my favorite.
Yeah, I love it. Curry goat, love it. Yeah.
So you learn to not just feed yourself, but feed your fellow students. So I think on the cooking side, I was well equipped. I think when danger really first came to me, because I did very well, not having a credit card, managing my money very well all the way through. When I got my first graduate job, when I was just coming to the end of university, I'd got my first graduate job, and suddenly there was a credit card provider called Egg, which I think became subsumed by Prudential. I'm not sure.
Yes, it did. Yes, yeah.
And then Barclays. But I had, it was amazing marketing, and they were really targeting young people, and it had, it was the start of the 0% balance transfer and all of this kind of thing, can buy things on 0%. And I thought, okay, well, I'm moving down to London and I'm excited, and I need to furnish my flat and I need to furnish my room. And this looks, I'm a big girl.
Yeah.
I've got
this is what big girls do. They get a credit card, right?
Yeah, they get a credit card. And that was my first, I think, foray into the world of debt. And at the same time, I had this graduate account, and having never had the need for an overdraft up until that point, suddenly I had a 0% overdraft of £500.
So they're throwing it at you. They were throwing at you credit.
Absolutely. And I think, and it was at that point that I remember, thinking back to, some of the snippets of conversations I would hear from my parents. I know that my mom had an overdraft, and I remember not even thinking of it as debt, because of, the way that I would hear my mom refer to the overdraft. It would just be, oh, well, I've still got some overdraft left, so it's fine. If we want to buy something, but I need to buy it in the overdraft, that's okay because I get paid tomorrow, kind of thing. And so when I was offered an overdraft, I don't think I thought of it in the same way as an aggressive credit card or an aggressive loan.
So your mum had legitimised it through her language.
That's it. Exactly. Okay. And it's only now that I think, when I speak to women and I say, an overdraft is still debt and they can claw it back at any time. So you really got to think of it as the same as any other kind of debt.
Yeah. So you got through university, you started your graduate job, you got, you had this 0% overdraft, and you've got the Egg card, you're all happening, you bought your stuff in your flat. How did the first 4 or 5 years of your career go? Did you suffer from lifestyle creep? In other words, spending up to what you were earning, or did you get really intentional, or did you build up debt, or how did you navigate those first formative years of your career?
Yeah. I think, so that was the exciting time. So having, not been wild at university, I think when I first moved to London, of course, I loved the world. Yeah, I loved the city. I loved the world of finance. There were dinners every night with clients. There was, all the shops and, the designer shoes, the designer handbags. Yeah. It was everywhere. And I wanted it all. And I was like, I can see, the lifestyle creep for sure, as a young woman, you're 21 and you're now working in this massive bank, and you see women that are doing amazing things. And I was always inspired by the women in senior leadership positions who were really well put together. They were going out for they could get blow dries at lunchtime. And I thought, wow, like this is real glamour, and I want to be like them. And so of course you're trying to dress for the advice you were given was dress for the position that you want. And so I thought, okay, well, that means that I have to dress like that woman because I want to be in her job in a few years' time. So definitely that lifestyle creep was there. And I think with my, brandishing my 0% Egg card, which very quickly became not 0% anymore. And I was like, oh, well, it's fine because every time I earn some money, I just pay it down. So this idea of this revolving credit that you just never get rid of, that only really caught up to me. Probably, I would say after about 5 years, when I was like, oh God, like I've dug a real ditch for myself here. I started off with 500 and now I'm on like $3,000. And that was when, I decided I've got to do something about this. I've got to clear it. $3,000 may seem small to some people, but to me, it was a horror.
What was the catalyst? What was the, I'm not putting up with this anymore? What was the main thing where it made you realize this was the wrong path? Or as I call it, you'd gone down a cul-de-sac and you got stuck there.
Yeah. I think it was, it's really funny, how moments of truth come to you. But I remember there was a time, like I'm somebody that deals with all of my life admin online. And if you imagine, like it's only very recently, and there are still lots of, particularly financial services providers, that surprisingly still try to send you letters. Now I have stashes of letters that I just never open because I'm like, why are you sending me letters? Yeah. Who opens about? Letters? What is this? Yeah. So I remember getting a letter, like opening an Egg statement and going, sorry, what? What's this? I thought I had £500. Why does it say 3,000? And I remember ringing them and saying, there must be some mistake. Like I've got £500, like my limit was £500. And I hadn't realized, of course, again, every time, as much as I'm spending and repaying, they're increasing the limits each time. So I'm just spending and spending and spending, never checking, because I just wasn't doing that. I was like, well, as long as I can afford to repay it, it doesn't really matter if I'm only repaying the interest. I just didn't have that grasp on reality. So when I opened that letter and rang them, honestly, you could have knocked me down with a feather. I was just I had this kind of this overwhelming feeling of shame, I think, because I think, having had the background that I've had, and knowing that, my whole family was so proud of me, one of the first to go to university, and, Dav's doing so well and she manages her money really well. We don't need to worry about her. And then I'm like, why have I got this bill for $3,000? Like, how could I ever explain how I've got into this situation? Because I don't even have anything to show for it. I think it was that was my moment of truth.
Thank you for sharing that. And that's really, I love the humility you got of actually saying that, because shame, guilt, embarrassment, and fear, these are all very strong emotions, and they're extremely negative, and they add to stress, and they really attack your self-esteem and your self-image. And lots of people are in denial about their financial situation, and the shame comes because you, as you say, it's not like you tried to start a business and it went wrong and you've left with a debt. You just consumed it, and that's where the shame comes in, because you then feel that you've let your grandmother down, probably, because if she knew, she would be Caribbean accent, probably saying a few harsh words to you. So what did you do then? What was your plan of action once you suddenly realized this £3,000 was like the bolt from blue and a wake-up call?
Well, I am very much a kind of I'm kind of a tough love person, even with myself. And so immediately I went into, so after, I had the bit of, kind of like self-flagellation, and then I just kind of ripped the plaster off, and I was like, okay, immediately I took the card out of my purse, cut it up and put it in the bin. And I remember I said to Egg then, I need you to close my account. And the woman was like, oh, well, you still got this balance. And I'm like, no, I'm going to pay down the balance incrementally, but I want the account closed. I don't want the ability
you can have your account closed with a negative balance. People don't know about that, do they?
Yes, exactly. So I said to her, she was like, oh, well, you can't because so I was like, I need to not have the ability to spend on this anymore. Now, at that point, I wasn't in a situation where I was completely addicted and needed to use it, but I just wanted to feel psychologically that was not an avenue. I didn't have that as a lifeline.
That wasn't an option then from then on.
No, not at all. So that, and so over the course of maybe 6 months, I paid down that debt. And I remember it was probably around Christmas, and I felt like I'd won the lottery, because I was like, oh my gosh, like this was a noose around my neck, and I didn't even know it was there. And as soon as I knew it was there, then I took steps to doing something about it.
So you did something concrete. You had a plan of action, and you took responsibility. Interestingly, I haven't had debt for a long time, and I recently got rid of my credit cards, because I suddenly realized, hang on, I'm teaching people about debt. I thought, well, convincing myself about points and protection on the internet, it's all BS. So I rang up American Express. I was convincing myself I was getting points from BA and all this stuff. It's all a load of rubbish. And I rang up and said, I'd like to cancel my card. She goes, well, why do you want to cancel it? I said, because I don't need it anymore. I don't want it in my life. And the lady said, you sound upset. I said, I'm not upset. I said, I'm not. I mean, me and the card are finished. She goes, but you pay it every month. I said, I know, but I don't need it in my life. I said, we're through. I said, it's been a good while it lasted, but we're through. I've moved on. And she laughed, the lady. She said, well, I can close it, but what do you want me to do with these 200,000 points? I said, keep them.
Wow. Oh my God.
No, I didn't. It's a long story, but I did get them put onto a free card, and then I moved them onto my BA account. But the point is, it's easy to get, as Dave Ramsey in the States says, it's easy to wander into debt, but it's so much harder to wander out.
It's like once they've got you in their clutches, they want to release you.
They're not your friend, yeah. So let's move on then. So you got rid of the credit card debt, and how did your relationship with money then evolve? To where you are today, and how did you develop? What principles did you develop, and how are they helping you?
I think coming to the end of that, that example that I gave about the credit card, I think the other moment of truth for me was buying a flat. And I was quite fortunate in the sense that, when so many young people struggle to get on the property ladder, one of the things that I learned from my dad, he came down, I remember when I first moved to London, and he was just appalled by the price of rent, or, how much we were having to make in rental payments compared to what the value would have been in Birmingham. And of course, my parents own their home. And so there was a big family trend of home ownership. So the idea of renting to them was just really alien. And I think when I obviously came down to London, and they're like, what on earth is this? Like, this is twice as much as we're paying for a mortgage on a 3-bedroom house. And so my dad really, really encouraged me, recognizing that, I was earning a good salary, to buy a flat. And I remember even having the conversation with him and saying, oh, well, I've saved this money and I really want to buy a car. And my dad was like, why do you want to buy a car? And I'm like, well, I've got a Ford KA. I don't want a Ford KA. I want an Audi. And my dad was like, no, Dav, you need to buy somewhere to live. And so I bought, I had this wrangle with him, but in the end I bought a flat, and it's one of the best investment decisions I've ever made. And I think at that juncture, obviously, suddenly I was like, oh God, so now I've gone from the $3,000 of debt to suddenly $200,000 of debt. And so I remember like really feeling like I was in quicksand at that point, like a mortgage just felt so monumental to me. And then recognizing, okay, now you have to be really ruthless with your finances. You can't afford to have those kinds of random slip-ups anymore, Dav. So that was when I started to document things. I think that was the turning point for me, in suddenly saying, okay, now I've got a spreadsheet. What's coming in every month and what's going out to the penny. And that was really when I think, as I say, the turning point in terms of my own self-discovery with money came from.
Well, there's two things there. Actually, housing as an investment isn't actually particularly good investment, but if you compare it to equities, but because we all need somewhere to live, right?
Yes.
That always tips it in the favor. And secondly, it's an enforced form of savings as long as you don't rack up consumer debt. So you're absolutely proving the 2 points. So you'd rationalize the debt on the basis that you need somewhere to live anyway. But it was actually the catalyst. It gave you the excuse, if you will, or the backdrop or the story or the narrative to get serious and be responsible about how you were spending your money. So from there to here, what are your sort of top tips for people? What are your principles that you run your personal finances by that you now also share with other people?
Oh, that last point is the main one, which is make sure you're tracking your income and expenditure. So it really goes back to that, my grandmother's point, which is don't cut your cloth bigger than your size. Make sure that you're able to live within your means. But also I would, I always stress, it doesn't mean that you've got to live this life of, extreme deprivation. If you want to go out, if there are things that you enjoy to do that you shouldn't do.
You can enjoy life, yeah.
Exactly. We need to make sure that we are enjoying life, because that's not good for our mental well-being either. If we're like, oh, well, I'm just saving and saving. Right? So, yeah. Exactly. So that's really important. I think the second point is about making sure that you've always got a cushion. So, having your rainy day fund. For my grandparents, it was their partner hand. For me, it was, always having, a stash of money that if something went wrong, I could be I could self-sustain. And I think, that was another thing that was really important to me. I always want to be independent. So I always felt like I never want to go to my family for money. So having my own stash of cash was really important to me. And then think long term. So one of the first things, coming into the city, and again, working in the world of finance, you're entered into a pension scheme, didn't have any idea what it was at all. But one of the lessons that my mum always gave was that, working in a school, she worked for the Education Authority, she would have had a workplace pension through the Education Authority, but my mum always paid into a private pension. So, that again, perhaps something that she would have taken from my grandmother, making sure you've got your nest egg for future is really key. So that's something that, I always hold true to as well.
Yeah. Great principles. And in respect of women, as we sort of draw to a close today, but in respect of women, what do you think the challenges and opportunities are for women when it comes to thinking about their finances, and what can they do to improve them?
I'm so happy that you said opportunities, because I think so much of the narrative and the language that's used around women is around, the gaps and these chasms that exist between men and women. And it can really, the victim, and I hate it. So I think, yes, there are challenges. And, we know that, there's this looming retirement crisis, and that women are saving, we live longer, we save less for retirement, and we don't invest at anywhere near the same rates as men do, despite, as you rightly outlined, investing, outperforming cash saving over a long-term period. And so from my perspective, I think the real opportunity for women is to kind of take a step back and go, we now have so much more access to the markets than we've ever had before. Whether you're trying to save and invest, small amounts of money, or you've got large amounts of money to part with, you've got the best opportunity to put your money into a very simple platform. There are a number of them out there. And know that your money will be accruing over time. And you don't have to be an investment expert to do that. You just need to have the desire to want to working as hard for you as you work for it. So I think that's the real opportunity for women to kind of take hold of the situation, identify some really simple investment solutions for them, and start to take action straight away. I always say a baby step is still a step.
Yeah. Oh, well, just get going is the big key thing, isn't it?
Yeah.
I just want to finish on one final question. I hold premium bonds as part of my cash reserve, not because they're a great return on investment. And, I disagree with Martin Lewis about, cash is a better return and all that, forget all that. Because I like the idea that I could potentially win the million, not necessarily because I need it, and I'm not trying to be flash or anything. I don't have any debt, and I've got built savings and wealth, and But what would you do if you won the premium bonds, the big one of the two £1 million prizes tomorrow? What would be how would you be thinking about dealing with that lump of money?
Oh my gosh. I mean, immediately I would buy a guest house in the Caribbean, one of my favorite Caribbean islands.
Right.
And I would turn it into a creative space where the writers and thinkers and people could come together and generate ideas.
Put me on your list. Seventh book next year. Yeah, go on.
Amazing. Yeah, I would build a retreat. I would love to do that. And I think it would combine all of the things that I love to do. So it would obviously combine my love of the Caribbean, but also providing a space for the real creatives to come together and generate new ideas and to unwind their brains.
Mm. Well, what you've really said there is that if we start dreaming, we don't have to live in the future or ruminate about the past. We must live and enjoy the moment. And it's very important to embrace the present. But having a kind of an idea of how you might change your life and the role of money in it, I think is a really liberating and exciting thing that doesn't take you away from the present, but it just gives you momentum and direction. So look, you've been very gracious of your time, Davinia. I really, really appreciate it. I think your messages are timeless, they're relevant, and they're just so simple. And I'm very grateful for you to taking the time out of your busy schedule, being on the show. We'll make sure your Instagram handle is Rainchq. Is that right? How's that spelled?
Yes. Rainchq.
Great stuff. Well, we'll make sure that's in the show notes. Do check Davinia out. Do you do lives on Instagram as well?
Yes, we do lives fairly regularly. So yeah.
Great stuff. Well, look,
please come and join us.
Yeah, do check out Rainchq on Instagram. Very accessible, whether you're a man or a woman, particularly women, but also men. I listen to Woman's Hour, right, as well on the BBC. So, women's programs are very good for men. So, look, check her out on Instagram. Brilliant. She's doing great stuff. And you're in a safe space there to ask all the silly questions, because there are no silly questions. Davinia, thanks very much for being on the show.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening. If you want more money insights, do visit my website at jason-butler.com or connect with me on Twitter or Instagram at JB the Wealthman. See you next time.